In this chapter, we'll be discussing how to work with layers in the Layers panel. There are a lot of ways you can create and organize your layers, and these are all of the topics I'll be showing you in this chapter. Let's start out by learning how to create new layers inside of Photoshop, and we'll begin with creating blank layers. One reason you may want to use a blank layer when editing your photos is for certain types of non-destructive editing. Some of these examples are dodging and burning and cloning. To create a new blank layer, you simply use that plus icon in the Layers panel, and it creates a brand new empty layer just above the image that you had selected. Another way to create a layer is to create it from an image. You might want to do this to mask a layer, to do some type of composite work. Maybe you're adding a texture or you're working with a collage. There are a lot of reasons that you would want to add a different image into your document as a new layer. So let's jump over to Photoshop and I'll show you how you can create both new blank layers as well as layers from images. This image only has one layer inside of this document. You can see that over in the Layers panel. Let's first start out by creating a new blank layer. The easiest way is just to go to the Layers panel and click that plus icon. That adds a new blank layer above whichever layer you had selected. You can also add a new blank layer from the menu. To do that, go up to Layer, New, Layer. You'll get a few options where you can name it, create a clipping mask, and play around with some of the other settings as well. But you can ignore all that and just click OK if you like, and that just adds a new blank layer, same as before, just above whichever layer was selected. I'm going to go ahead and delete both of these layers. Now let's talk about adding an image as a layer. I'm going to start out by using my favorite method, which is the simple dragging and dropping. So I'm going to go into my folder, and I have an image here. I'm going to go ahead and click and drag this image over the open document. By default, once you do that, you get the transform controls around your image. If you just want to keep your image as is, simply press that Return or Enter key, and now you can see that new image over in your Layers panel. Another thing that happens by default is that when you place images like this by dragging and dropping, it adds them as smart objects. Now, if you don't want to work with smart objects, you can change that by going into the Preferences. So if you go up to Photoshop, Preferences, General, right here there's an option that says Always create smart objects when placing. If you uncheck that box, then when you place an image by either the drag and drop method that I just showed you or by the menu option, which I'll show you here in just a moment, it's just going to add it as a simple pixel layer, really similar to the background layer. I like to use smart objects when I place my files, but if you don't want to use it as a smart object, you can also rasterize that file using the Layers panel. Another thing you can change in here is this resize image during place. If you don't want to have to press enter every single time you drag and drop a file, you can just uncheck that and you won't get that transform box around your image. I'm just going to go ahead and keep everything here as the default settings, and it's typically how I like to work anyway, so I'll just keep it as is and click OK. I'm going to go ahead and delete this layer, so I'll just press that delete key with that layer highlighted. Now let's go ahead and use the menu option to basically do that same thing. I'm going to go up to File, and I'll go down to Place Embedded. You don't really want to use the Place Linked because what that does is it references the original file. So if you updated the original file, then it would also update in your document. It definitely has its uses, but for the most part, you're probably not going to want to do that. So just stick with Placed Embedded, and this basically just adds the photo as a new layer, and it forgets that it existed on your computer. So I'll click Place Embedded, and then you just navigate to the file that you want to add and click Place. The image will pop up with that transform box. If you still have that checked in the preferences, simply press Return or Enter, and now you have a new layer just like before when I dragged and dropped it. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this layer again, and I'll show you another method, which is simply to copy and paste. So I'm actually going to go into my folder, and I'm just going to open this up. So I'll just double click to open that file. Now, if I look at the top here inside of my documents, I have two tabs. I have the layer that I just opened, and then I have that layer that I've had open previously. So I'm going to go back to the turtle image that I just opened, and I'm going to select all and then copy and paste. So I'll go ahead and select this layer. I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut Command or Control A. Then I'm going to copy this layer. So I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut Command or Control C. Then I'll go back to my original image and paste it using the keyboard shortcut Command or Control V. Over in the Layers panel, you'll see I now have that brand new layer on top of the other background layer. It's a standard layer, it's not a smart object this time. So that's a good way if you're working on several documents to kind of copy and paste things back and forth. You can also copy and paste items from outside of Photoshop, such as if you copied something from the internet, like right-clicked and copied something, you could go into Photoshop and paste it. So that's just another way that you can add images as a layer inside of Photoshop. Now let's talk about rearranging layers in Photoshop. The order of the layers in the Layers panel affects how the image will look. Changing the order of the layers can alter that look of your photo as well. You simply do this by dragging and dropping. So let's jump over to Photoshop and take a look at how this works. I have a photo here of a little baby with a texture applied along with a curves adjustment and black and white. Let's go ahead and start with the base layer here, and I'll reveal each layer so you can see how they kind of build up to create this effect. So I have that layer with the image of the baby. Directly on top of that is a texture layer. You can see that it's blended, so some of that color as well as obviously the texture is showing through on that baby. Then I have a curves adjustment just above that, which is adding a good S-curve, so it's adding a lot of contrast to the photo. And then directly above that is a black and white adjustment. Now, because the black and white adjustment is at the very top of the Layers panel, that means that it's affecting everything. It's affecting, of course, the background layer of the baby, but it's also affecting that texture layer as well as the curves adjustment. Let's see what happens if I take the texture and move it to the top. Moving a layer in the Layers panel is as simple as clicking and then just dragging it. And when you see that blue line appear, wherever you release, that's where the layer is going to appear. So I want this to be at the very top of the Layers panel. I'm dragging it to the top, and there's a blue line at the top of the Layers panel. I'll release, and now that texture is at the very top. So what we have in this image now is an image with a black and white adjustment and some curves added, and then the texture's at the very top. So even though the baby picture is black and white, it lost all of its color from that black and white adjustment. Because the texture layer is on the very top, the color from that texture is showing through. If I were to take the curves adjustment and move it to the top, now the curves adjustment is affecting the texture layer, so it's adding more contrast to the texture layer as well as the background layer. It's also going to be affecting the black and white layer as well. So moving these around can give you different effects, and it's just something that you really want to keep in mind when working on your documents. Let's jump over to another example. Here I have a photo with two Polaroid images, and one of them is stacked on top of the other. If you look in the Layers panel, the waterfall photo on the right is above the blue boats picture on the left. And if you notice kind of in the center of that image, that's where they overlap. If I were to take that waterfall, that group of images there, and I'll just expand it real quickly so you can see that there are quite a few layers inside of this group. If I were to take that group and drag it below the blue boats picture, if you look at the center there of the image, the blue boats Polaroid is now overlapping the waterfall picture. So just keep in mind when you're working on your image that layer order is important, but it's really easy to kind of work with and play around with and move those layers to get the look that you want. Now let's talk about grouping layers. When you have a document with several layers, it helps to group the layers together. Grouping layers will also allow you to create different effects all at once. You can make adjustments to blending modes, opacity, and so on. Let's take a look at some examples in Photoshop so I can show you how to actually create these groups, as well as how to adjust them and make alterations to one group to affect multiple layers at a time. Here I have a photo, and if you look at the layers document, it has several layers in it. I added a whole lot of texture to this, I replaced the sky, and I added a border. I'll show you a quick before and after here so you can kind of see where it started and then where it ended up. I'm going to focus on the textures near the bottom of the layers panel, and what I'd like to do is group these together to make it a little bit easier to keep this whole thing organized. If you'd like to create an empty group, you can do that in the layers panel just by clicking on this little folder icon. The group will appear above whatever layer you have selected, and then you can add layers into that group. To add things to a group, simply drag and drop them into the group. So I'll go ahead and start out with this teardrop texture. I'm just going to click and drag it, and you can see that the group is outlined, so there's kind of a rectangle blue highlight around that group. If I go a little lower, I can also just kind of put it right below it, and as long as there's a little indent there, and it's not aligned with the other layers in the document, that means that it's inside of that group. So I can keep adding layers to the group, just like that. I'm going to undo all of that just to kind of backtrack and remove that group and show you a few other ways to do this a little bit more quickly. So I know that I want to add these textures to the group. So I'm just going to highlight the textures. I'll click that top one, hold my Shift key, and then click the bottom texture. Then I'll click that group icon at the bottom, and that automatically created that group. If I click that little arrow on the left, it'll drop down so I can actually see what's inside of the group. Another way to create groups is in the little menu here inside of the Layers panel. Just click that drop down and you have New Group or New Group from Layers. So if you have any layers that is not the background layer, it's going to add them to the group as soon as you click that option. Let's jump over to another photo and see a different example. So here I have an image and I've added some overlays along with a little bit of color stylizing with a gradient map. I'm going to expand the group so we can see what's inside of it, and I'm also going to click on it. So if you notice in that blending dropdown, it has a blending mode set to pass through. This is a special blending mode that really only applies to groups once you add things into the group. Now you basically want to keep it set to pass through, otherwise it could affect how your image looks. So for example, this layer here is set to the screen blending mode, as is the other overlay. If I were to go back to that group and change this to normal, I'm not able to actually see anything outside of this layer. So it kind of lost the transparency of my blend modes when I changed that. But what you can do is change it to other blending modes. So let me kind of go down and see what might look kind of fun. So like hard light. If I were to change this to hard light, it's still taking into account that I have screen blending modes set inside of each of these layers, but it's also manipulating it even more. I'm also going to change the opacity of this group. So I'll set that down to maybe about halfway. And so now I have one group and I'm able to affect all of the items inside of that group by playing around with those settings in the Layers panel. So groups are really great for keeping your Layers panel organized, as well as making unique stylizations to your photo and kind of playing around with those different settings. Sometimes the results that you get are going to be a little unexpected, but the great thing is you're working in layers, so everything is non-destructive. You can kind of move things around and even play with the different blend modes to see what kind of effects you can create. Now let's talk about duplicating layers. Duplicating layers in Photoshop is a huge time saver. Let's say you want to reuse something that took some time to create, or maybe you don't know where it is on your computer. Instead of having to redo the layer or actually find the file, you can simply create a copy of it inside of the Layers panel. And you can also duplicate multiple layers, so whatever you have highlighted in there, you can duplicate. Let's jump over to Photoshop and see how this works. So here I have a photo with a texture, and I've changed that blend mode to overlay. So it gives it a nice kind of a textured look. Duplicating a texture layer, especially with a blend mode, can really help to intensify that texture effect. Or you can also use that same layer and blend it differently to get a different look altogether. Creating a duplicate of a layer is as simple as using the keyboard shortcut Command or Control J. I'm going to delete that because another method that you can use is inside of the Layers panel. You can simply click and drag whichever layer or layers or group you have selected, drag it down to that plus icon, and it creates a duplicate of that layer. Now for this example, Duplicating the layer with that same blend mode just really intensifies that effect. So if you're looking for a super grungy look, you can duplicate your layer with the same blending mode and get something similar to this. Or you can play around with different blending modes using the same texture. So if I just kind of hover over, I can see what kind of effects I can get. There's some really neat things in here that look a little different than if I only had that one texture layer to begin with. Or maybe I'll take it down to color and just get an interesting color look. I find myself duplicating layers in Photoshop all the time, especially with textures. I do it a lot with textures because I like to play around with the different kind of blendings that I can get with them. Now let's jump over to another example. So for this image, I have a background layer and I also have a gradient map adjustment layer. And you can see it's adding a nice effect. But I'd really like this effect even more exaggerated, so I'm going to duplicate this adjustment layer. I have that layer selected. I'll go ahead and use the keyboard shortcut, Command or Control J. So now I have that exact same gradient map added, and it's also blended the same way, and it was just able to really intensify that coloring effect. Now, oftentimes when I do this, when I'm working on my images, I'll duplicate an effect, and then I tend to go into the opacity setting and scale it back a touch. So you can do that instead of having to actually play around with the adjustment. Just scale that opacity back to kind of subdue the effect. So that's how you duplicate layers in Photoshop. I think you'll find it a really useful tool, and it's a good way to kind of play around with different effects, especially when you find yourself working on a photo and you like where it's going, but you feel like it needs something a little bit more. Try duplicating some of your existing layers to see if just replicating and kind of changing the opacity and the blend mode of that effect kind of brings it to where you want it to be. Giving your layers and groups unique names can be helpful to keep your layers panel organized. When you only have a few layers, it's easy to know what's happening. But when you start creating documents with several layers, giving them relevant names can prevent confusion down the road, especially if you need to reopen and edit the file down the road. Let's go ahead and jump into Photoshop so I can show you how you can rename these layers and groups. I have this photo here, and I'm going to go ahead and add an effect and rename the layer. So I'm going to go down to the Adjustments panel, and I'm going to add a black and white adjustment. Then I'm going to go into the Layers panel. I'm going to click that blend dropdown and change it to Overlay. So now I no longer have an actual black and white effect applied. I have what I like to call kind of a grunge effect. Now this is a pretty simple document. I only have one layer in here, but even so, it's not a bad idea to get in the habit of renaming those layers. So I'm going to go ahead and go over to the name of this layer. I'm going to double click it, and then you'll see that it's highlighted. Now we'll go ahead and change this, and I'll call this one Grunge Effect. And then I just press Return to commit that change. And I can go back and change it again if I need to, but right now I know in this document, this is not a black and white adjustment, it's a grunge effect. Now I can recognize that it is a black and white adjustment applied because I can recognize that adjustment layer icon in the Layers panel. But the name is making it a lot more clear of what it's actually doing to my photo. Let's jump over to another image and take another look at this. We're going to go ahead and collapse some of these panels here so we can see all of the layers. So here I have this group that I created in a previous lesson. Most of the time your groups are going to be collapsed, so it kind of keeps things a little tidier inside of that Layers panel. And just by looking at this, I don't know what's inside this group. So just like I did with that layer, I can double click the name of that group and I can give it a different name. And I'll call this one Textures. I can even continue to kind of clean up this document by renaming some of the other layers. This layer here is applying birds to the sky. So I'll go ahead and double click that name of that layer and just call it Birds. The layer above it, this texture layer, is pretty much what it is, and that's same with that top layer. And then I have a color lookup adjustment, and that's just adding a nice effect there. So I probably don't need to make any adjustments to that. How you rename your layers and which ones you rename is really up to you, but it's a really good idea to get in the habit because once you start making adjustments or you have several layers that you're masking or doing a lot of crazy things with, it can be really helpful with your workflow to have very easy to read and easy to follow names inside of that Layers panel. In this lesson, let's talk about merging layers. Merging layers allows you to combine layers together. If you want to maintain a non-destructive workflow, you may not use this method too often. However, it's good to know how to merge your layers if the need arises. Now you can see here in this example on the left, we have merge down, merge visible, and flatten image. And there's another option there that's only visible under certain circumstances, and that's called merge layers. And I'm going to show you all of these in Photoshop. So let's jump over to Photoshop, and I'll show you how to merge layers. So I have this photo here. I have a texture, a black and white, some dodging and burning, and a curves adjustment added to it. So here's just a quick before and after of what this image looks like. Let's go ahead and start merging some of these layers together so you can kind of get a feel for how this works. If you'd like to just simply merge two layers together, just make them one, you can select two or more layers and then use that drop down up on the top right and go down to merge layers. Alternately, and I'll go ahead and do this for you, you can right-click over that file to get to the same option. So I'll go ahead and merge these two layers and let's see what happens. So what happened was both of those layers had different blending modes applied to them. The top one was overlay and the bottom was soft light. But when they were merged together, it just kind of discarded that information. So now I would have to go in and actually blend these together. So I would go down and let's say change it to overlay. So I have that dodge and burn along with that vignette that I added, and they're merged together. I'm going to undo these and get back to where I have both of those layers because I want to show you an alternate way to merge two layers together. This top layer has a blending mode of overlay, and the bottom has a blending mode of soft light. If I click on this top layer and right-click, now I have the option to merge down. And what this does is it just takes whatever layer you have selected and it merges it with the layer below. And it's also going to retain things like the name of the bottom layer along with the blending mode of that bottom layer. So I'll go ahead and select merge down. And now you can see with this layer that it retained that name of the vignette layer, that lower layer, and it also retained the blend mode of that bottom layer as well. I'm actually going to change this to overlay because I think that's a better fit to kind of really emphasize and accentuate the vignette in the photo. I'm going to go to this black and white layer here, and because this black and white layer is just kind of here in the middle of the layers panel, but it's above both that texture and the background layer, it's converting everything to black and white. So I'm just going to go ahead and right-click this image, and I'm going to select Merge Down. And now if you look at that layer, it's that same texture layer, but now it's only in black and white. Now, this was a destructive edit. I lost all of the color in that layer, but if that's not important to you and you don't need to retain that, merging those layers together is one way to convert that specific texture layer or any layer to black and white or apply any type of effect that you want. Let's go back to that menu. I'm going to go ahead and right-click, and you'll see another option here called Merge Visible. Now, right now, every single thing in my layers panel, so let's go ahead and hide the texture layer. And now I'll right-click over one of the other images and select Merge Visible. Every single thing has now been merged into the background layer, except for that texture layer, which was not visible when I used that command. I'm going to undo that and kind of go back to where I had all of those layers. And let's look at another option. If I right-click and select Flatten, this is going to discard every single layer that I have, including any hidden layers, and it's going to convert everything into a background layer. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll click Flatten Image, and it's going to give me a pop-up that's telling me all of those hidden layers are just going to be discarded. They're just going to disappear, and they're not going to be applied to that photo. So I'll go ahead and click OK, and now in the Layers panel, I simply have a background layer with all of those visible layers applied to it. This is a step you might want to do if you're working on a photo that's a JPEG, and maybe you're making a few adjustments to it, but you still want to keep it a JPEG file. At the end of all of your edits, you would flatten your file, which would be a destructive edit, meaning you would no longer be able to access any of those layers that you had, such as adjustments. But it is how you take a JPEG file that you're editing and then make sure that you can actually save it as that same JPEG file. I'm going to undo that because I definitely don't want to flatten everything. And I'm going to show you one more kind of cool trick, and this is probably the way I merge my photos the most. So first of all, I'm going to go ahead and make that texture layer visible. And then I'm going to go to the very top of my layers panel. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to merge all of these layers, but then I'm going to put it on a brand new layer at the top of the layers panel, or really above whichever layer that you have selected. And that's going to merge all the layers, create a copy of it, and then just position it at the top of the layers panel. So let's just go ahead and do it. The keyboard shortcut to do this for a Mac is Command-Option-Shift-E. On a PC, that's going to be Control-Alt-Shift-E. So I click all of those, and now if you look at that top layer, I have a brand new layer that combines every single layer that was below it. One reason that I use this merge effect is to create the Orton effect. So I have that new layer at the top of my layers panel. I'm going to go up to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. I like to give my image a nice blur, something just about like this, so I can still see the outline of my image, but most of the details are fuzzy. And then I just click OK. Next, I go over to that blend mode, and I change it to either overlay or soft light. And now if I toggle this off and on, what I've done is I was able to add kind of like a glowy, contrasty, vibrant layer. And this blends really well to give a lot of beautiful contrast and color to your image. If the effect is too intense, simply take that opacity slider and reduce it. One way people describe creating that merged layer is kind of like a stamped layer, because you're just kind of taking all those layers and just stamping it at the top. I like to call it the claw because you have to use so many buttons in that keyboard shortcut. But this is definitely the merge technique that I tend to use the most. A lot of the other ones I tend to avoid because they are destructive, but it's good to know how to use them because sometimes you do need to merge your layers in order to create certain types of effects. In this lesson, let's go ahead and talk about transforming a layer. There are a lot of different ways that you can actually transform and kind of distort your photos. Most of the time, I'm using transform tools to do things like you see on the left here to set a texture so it fits the image properly. And I'm going to show you how to do this in Photoshop here in just a moment. But you also have a lot of other options that you can work with. And I'm going to show you how some of these work and also a few practical ways that you can actually use them. So let's go ahead and jump over to Photoshop and take a look. So here I have this image and I have a square texture layer on top of it. If I go up to Edit, I can see all of these different transform options. Free transform is probably what you'll use the most. It's easy to access using that keyboard shortcut Command or Control T. But you also have all of these other options here as well. For now, I'm going to go ahead and work with free transform, and I'll show you how the other options work with another photo. So I'm going to select free transform, and after I do that, I can see that I have those transform controls over the photo. There's also a blue X down the middle of my photo, and that's indicating that the image is a smart object. Now right away, if you look at the cursor on my screen, it has kind of a curved arrow. That means that I can rotate the photo. So if I just kind of spin it around, it's going to rotate there from that center. If you want to make sure that you keep it kind of level and squared off, hold that Shift key, and it will help guide it to keep it just, kind of level and straight in your image. Taking any of those sides is going to scale the image proportionally. I'm going to go ahead and undo that. If I were to hold the Option key, it's going to scale it, but it's going to keep that image centered. So if I just wanted to do a proportional scale outwards, then I would be able to just get it just like this, just by holding that Option or Alt key. By the way, at any time, if you want to kind of go back to where you were and get out of the transform tool, just press the Escape key, and it kind of gets you out of everything and resets your image. Let's get back to those transform tools by using the keyboard shortcut Command or Control T. By default, as you saw, Photoshop will scale things proportionally, but if you kind of want to scale it and stretch it out, add the Shift key to the equation. Now I can stretch it, and I can actually make it a different shape than it originally was. I'm going to undo that, and what I want to do for this image is I want to stretch it out, but I also want to keep it centered, which will help stretch it on both sides at the same time. So if I press and hold both the Shift and the Option or Alt key, and then take it from one of those sides. It's going to stretch it, and then it should snap to the edge there. If you're not getting your image to snap that way, go up to View and make sure that Snap is checked. That will help you kind of keep things right on the edge of whichever edge you're dragging it to. Once you're finished using the Transform tool, press the Return or Enter key. You can also press that check at the top that you saw there, and that will kind of get you back to this scene here. Then just go ahead and play with your photo. Here, I'll probably just go ahead and blend it there. And now I have that texture image covering the entire space of my background image. Now let's jump over to another photo and explore some of those other tools. In the Layers panel, I have a food photo, and right now it's only a background layer. If I go up to Edit, all of those transform options are grayed out, and that's because the image is a background layer. I need to convert this image to a regular layer in order to actually do some transforming. And you can do that really easily just by going over to that background layer and click the lock icon. And now I just have a standard layer that can be transformed and moved and manipulated. But because I'm going to be doing some transforming to this, I'm also going to convert this layer to a smart object. When you have a layer as a smart object, anything you transform can be easily brought back to its original size without degrading the photo. So I'll convert it to a smart object by right-clicking and going down to Convert to Smart Object. Now let's go ahead and play with some of those different transform tools. I'll go to Edit, Transform, and let's start out with Skew. Skew lets you just kind of slide the top corners around, and they basically just stay along the edges. Clicking one of the middle ones is going to take that full side and kind of push it up and down. You can also press and hold the Option key, and that's just going to skew the whole thing kind of proportionally on both sides. Now I'm going to press Return, and that basically committed that change. And if this were a regular layer, this would be completely distorted, and I wouldn't be able to get back the original kind of setup and the original transformation that it had. So if I go over to the Layers panel and right-click, all I need to do is go down to Reset Transform, and then it brings my image back. Now it looks like I moved it too, so I have that Move tool active. I'm just going to shift it down, but now I'm basically back to my original photo. Let's go back up to those Transform tools, and let's try a different one. So I'm going to select Distort. Now this does exactly what it sounds like. It distorts the photo. So you can click any of those sides, and it just is really going to warp it. And it's interesting because it changes the photo's shape on the inside and kind of what everything looks like. It's squishing it, it's stretching it. I mean, I'm really just kind of having fun with it here, but this is not something I would do to one of my photos. I'm going to escape out of that to go back to where we were originally. And next, I'm going to go over to Transform, and I'm going to select Perspective. The perspective transform is one that I do use on my photos, and in particular, I like to use them on my food photographs. So what I like to do is I set it to that perspective transform, then I go down to one of the bottom corners, and then I'm going to press and hold the Option or Alt key. Next, I'm going to click and drag, and what that's doing is it's pulling the perspective towards me. So it's kind of making that food image look a little bit larger. I'm going to go ahead and press Return to kind of commit that change, and I'm going to undo it, and I'm going to do a reverse undo so you can kind of see that before and after. So it's really helping the composition of that photo by bringing that front part of the image closer. Now you can experiment with this with a lot of different types of images, such as landscapes, maybe even portraits. You just want to make sure that you're not overly transforming something that would look funny, like a face or something like that. And again, if you are working with a smart object, you can easily go back to your original transformation just by right-clicking and select Reset Transform. The ability to hide and reveal layers in the Layers panel is helpful when making image adjustments and other effects. For example, it's helpful to preview an effect by hiding the layer to help visualize how intense your edits have affected the original image. Hiding and revealing a layer is as simple as clicking that little eyeball icon to the left of the layer thumbnail. Instead of talking about it here, let's jump into Photoshop and I can show you how this works. So here I have that image that I've shown you in a few other videos, and this just has a lot of layers, so it's a really great example of showing how this works. To hide a layer, you simply just click that eyeball and it disappears. It's a really good way to just kind of toggle off and on while you're watching your image to get an idea of what all of these layers are doing. Now, toggling one layer off and on is helpful, but what about previewing the entire before and after? So I'm going to go ahead and leave this layer hidden here, this taped edge layer, and I'm going to go down to the very bottom layer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to press and hold the Option or Alt key. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to click the eyeball next to that background layer. Now that will automatically hide any layer that was already visible. And then if you repeat the process by holding that Option or Alt key and then clicking that background again, it's going to bring back the visibility of all of those layers. Now, if you notice, that taped edge layer stayed hidden because it was hidden originally. I'm going to go ahead and toggle that back on so we can see that layer as well. And now let's see what happens if I toggle the visibility of only the taped edge layer. So I'm going to press and hold that Option or Alt key and click that layer. And now you can see that every single layer except for that taped edge layer is hidden. And if I repeat that process and click, now I can see all of those again. It's usually going to be most beneficial when you are doing this with the bottom layer or the main image layer, kind of the before and after look. But it can also be helpful for other layers as well. Now, if you were to do this, let's say I go ahead and press and hold that Option or Alt key and then I click. If I went through and started to kind of play around with some of the other layers and the visibility, and then I tried to repeat the process again by holding that Option or Alt key and clicking, it's not going to do anything because I already kind of disrupted the process. So make sure if you are going to kind of do that before and after preview that you go ahead and do it all at once. But here's another quick tip. Now that I have all of these layers hidden, I could go through and click each of them individually to make them visible. But another thing you can do is just click and drag all the way down, and that will basically set the visibility back to being visible for all of those hidden layers. And you can actually do the reverse as well. So if I click and drag, it's going to hide all of those layers. I'm going to make one of them visible, and just to demonstrate, I'm going to do it again. So I'm going to click and drag, and you can see it's just kind of ignoring that taped edge because it was already visible. But that's just a quick way to kind of sweep down and make all of your layers visible if for some reason you needed to do that. Now, I want to jump over to another photo because I want to show you a different type of visibility. So in this document, I have two layers in my layers panel. They're both layers of tulips, and I just have them stacked right on top of each other. I'm going to use my Move tool, which I already have active. If you don't have it active, go ahead and press the V key. That brings up the Move tool. I'm going to take that top layer, and I'm just going to drag it off of the screen. So it's actually there. It's still in my document. It's just hidden. And now you'll notice that my bottom layer is a background layer. And with this technique, I like to unlock this layer to transform it into a regular layer. That way, both of these layers can be moved and they have transparency around them. Next, I'm going to go up to Image, Reveal All. And what this does is it looks outside of that main kind of canvas area and it expands the canvas to include anything that's outside of it. I'm going to click back on that top layer of that orange tulip, and you'll notice that I moved it out a little too far, and I have some transparency there in between the layers. So let me go ahead and drag it to the left, so they're side by side, and now I have this transparent area here on the right. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Image, Trim, and here you have some options. Right now, the only thing that I have behind these images is transparent pixels. But if you had a color behind that, let's say that I had either a white or black background, you could choose either of these depending on where that background color resides. You can also choose which sides you want to trim away. If you want all of that area to disappear, then just keep all of them checked. And usually that's what I'm kind of going for. I want everything to disappear, and I just want to shrink my image down to only include the actual pixels. But you could be specific with these if you have a specific instance where you only want to trim from one side or only a couple of the sides. So I'm just going to keep all of those checked, and I'll click OK. And now you can see that area is now trimmed. So I wanted to share the reveal all and trim because I find it really useful for a lot of the things I do, and it's kind of a hidden feature there. If you don't know about it, then usually you're having to kind of move things and crop things, but those are really helpful tools to work with, and I hope you find them useful as well.